Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's not often that I have to speak before I get to eat, but thanks to Delta Airlines, we are running late, and my advice to any of you traveling, and Delta wouldn't want to hear this, but you need to stay away from the Atlanta airport for the next couple of months. They are they're reconstructing a runway in addition to the weather. Listening to your introduction reminds me of an experience I had when I was speaking in England once. I was introduced by a young member of the parliament who said that I've been reading the resume of our speaker, and it's obvious that he has not been able to keep a job. To which I replied, that's only half of it. I haven't been able to keep a profession. The historian Tacitus once defined patriotism as praiseworthy competition with one's ancestors. I recall that definition of civic virtue today because it reminds us that members of each generation have an obligation, indeed a civic duty, to contribute something as meaningful, as significant, and even as extraordinary as those who preceded them. And that is why I want to begin by congratulating the Clinton School of Public Service on the role you play in enhancing the capacity of generations far into the future to contribute to the public good. 2 weeks ago, we commemorated the first anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. We were reminded of both the devastation it caused and the pre-existing conditions it exposed. 2 days ago, we commemorated the 5th anniversary of 9/11. We're reminded of the depth of the inhumanity in the hearts and minds of some, and the depth of generosity in the hearts and souls of others. This is without doubt an awesome and almost apocalyptic global moment, an extraordinary time to contemplate public service. It is an era that has given birth to a lively debate about the role of ethics in the conduct of the public business of our democracy. The challenge for the university and for concerned others, therefore, is to inform and enrich that debate without getting caught up in the politics of virtue or the parochialism of dogma. This is thus a good time to think about ethics and diplomacy, to ask whether the marriage of these two concepts is a conceptual contradiction, an oxymoron, if you will, that has no place in the real politic of the modern world, as some claim. Or can there be principled diplomacy that considers both what is right and what is in the national interest? Now, some scholars, some of my colleagues in the realist tradition of international politics, would undoubtedly raise a skeptical eye at the notion of placing ethical boundaries around diplomacy. Such an effort might be even dismissed as an attempt by an idealist to attribute good to an area of activity where one must be prepared to do and say anything to promote the interests of his nation. But one of the most important lessons I learned from Nelson Mandela during my 4 years as the United States ambassador is that ethics in diplomacy is not only desirable, but altogether feasible. For Mandela, principled diplomacy was not a theory, it was a way of being. The question future generations will want to know is, why did an elderly African leader in a small country on the southern tip of the African continent attract so much attention, affection, and influence around the world at a time when political leaders were more distrusted than ever before? It is in answering that question that we understand why he is still so revered and respected even in retirement. Mandela's response to those who had imprisoned him and taken away 27 of his most productive years defied what we thought we knew about human nature. When others doubted whether it was still possible for old enemies to beat their swords into plowshares, he showed us how. He was a healer who understood that diversity need not divide, that pluralism, rightly understood and rightly practiced, is a benefit and not a burden, that the fear of difference is a fear of the future. He was an astute observer of the human condition who believed with all his being that we diminish the preciousness and sacredness of life when we denigrate, disrespect, or oppress people based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity or culture. He never allowed himself to be seduced by the trappings of power because he was grounded in a concept of community called Ubuntu, an idea that is best expressed by the Xhosa proverb, people are people through other people. I want us to look quickly at 5 lessons from Mandela's life and legacy that I believe should be instructive for those who seek to provide leadership for the world in which we now live. The first has to do with the distinction between leadership by coercion and leadership by attraction. A strategic distinction that is increasingly made between hard power and soft power. Far too many people, far too many Americans are still wedded to the notion that it is primarily through hard power, the use of military might or economic muscle, that we will secure our liberty and provide its blessings to future generations. I wish more of us understood the potential of soft power, the ability to attract and influence through the appeal of social, cultural, and moral messages, through acts of generosity, and through respect for local traditions and culture. As Professor Joseph Nye at the Kennedy School at Harvard put it, hard power is the ability to get others to do what we want, while soft power is the ability to get others to want the same things we do. We should have learned from Nelson Mandela's life story that while hard power can be used to inflict and even prevent pain. It is soft power that is most likely to develop attraction and influence that will long endure. Nelson Mandela represents the epitome of soft power. As president, his moral standing and political stature in the world went far beyond that suggested by the size of the military or the gross domestic product of the Republic of South Africa. Even in retirement, he remains influential because his attraction comes from the power of his personal story, the elegance of his humanity, and the strength of his ideals. He is the prototype of the leader whose influence comes not from military or economic might, but from the ability to capture the minds and hearts of people in all corners and all colors of the globe. Among the many lessons we should have learned from Nelson Mandela is the fact that diplomacy increasingly depends on a moral ecology that cannot be found in military or economic power. I've been living abroad full or part-time for more than a decade. What you were not told is that I served not only in 3 roles at Duke, but I served simultaneously on the faculty of the University of Cape Town. And so for the last 10 years, I've been living either full-time or part-time in South Africa. But whether abroad or at home, what has become clear to me is that while the United States has vast reservoirs of power, our influence in the world is nevertheless on a decline. Because we seem to have forgotten that seduction is always more effective than coercion. And as Nye reminds us, there is much about American values that are deeply attractive and seductive. Americans have been very good at wielding soft power. Remember the attraction of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms in Europe at the end of World War II. Of Chinese students symbolizing their protest in Tiananmen Square with a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Of Peace Corps volunteers winning the hearts and minds of American critics through selfless service. What is especially troubling about the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world at the moment is that just as soft power emerged as a major vehicle of influence, we deliberately dismantled some of our most powerful weapons. With half of the 6 billion people on Earth living on $2 a day, 1/3 not connected to any energy system, and 1/4 lacking clean water, Americans as a percentage of the GDP are spending less than half of what we spent a decade earlier to help the world's poor. The United States gives less than 1/10 of 1% of its GDP for non-military foreign aid. But according to public opinion polls, the public perception is that foreign aid is about 15%. At the same time, according to the same polls, Americans believe that foreign aid would be right at 5%. Why then, in an age of soft power, Are we seeking a 0.1% solutions to the problems of an interdependent world when the American people would be willing to do more? Now, of course, the public perception of some is that aid has largely failed. Yet, it is in large part due to foreign aid that world literacy rose by nearly 50% in the last third of the 20th century. Infant mortality was cut in half. Life expectancy tripled, and more than 70 nations became free or partly free. What I'm suggesting is that we need a new constituency for development aid, not simply because it is a humanitarian thing to do, but because it is in our national self-interest. As Jim Wolferson, the former president of the World Bank, reminds us, security for our nation will be difficult as long as 20% of the global population receives more than 80% of the global income. Security will be difficult as long as the average income for the richest 20 countries is 37 times the average of the poorest 20. Security will be difficult as long as 1.2 billion people still live under less than $1 a day, and 2.8 billion still live on less than $2 a day. Of course, it is also true that how we are perceived outside our borders depends on what we do within our borders to deliver on the promise of our founders to form a more perfect union, to establish justice and to promote the general welfare. It is increasingly clear that the best way to demonstrate the efficacy of our democracy to critics abroad is to demonstrate that it can work equitably for all of our citizens at home. The second lesson I learned from Nelson Mandela has to do with his belief that most conflicts can be solved by brains rather than blood. He gave primacy to reconciliation as a public value. He promoted peaceful coexistence in international affairs with the same moral audacity that he promoted reconciliation in domestic affairs. The first time I was asked to meet with him to register my government's concern about proposed visits to South Africa by the heads of state of Cuba, of Libya, and Iran, I delivered a carefully prepared démarche, as is the practice in such matters. He listened to me carefully and he said, "Tell your government that I negotiated with the representatives of the apartheid state without compromising any of my values, and there is no danger of my compromising them now." His commitment to universality in foreign affairs and loyalty to his friends who had supported his cause when U.S. leaders considered his organization a terrorist organization often caused alarm in Washington and London. But he remained true to his word and true to his basic values. We can learn much from the fact that while the focus on values in the United States was on the microethics of individual behavior, he was concerned with the macroethics of institutions and societies. It was not that he was uninterested in the private virtues that build character. It was that he sought to expand the public discourse to include the public values that build community. I don't know whether he ever read any of the works of Reinhold Niebuhr, but he understood, like Niebuhr, that while we know a lot about how to apply ethics to our personal lives, we find it difficult to apply ethics to our aggregate existence. It is appropriate that we associate Mandela with reconciliation, but it is important to remember that different forms, different kinds of conflict require different forms of reconciliation. And so he made a distinction between individual and personal reconciliation that may require the healing of deep psychological and emotional wounds, and political reconciliation that require a different focus, one that requires less forgiveness than a desire for sustained and meaningful interaction. One of the staff members to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who now directs the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, likes to quote a Dinka elder who, on reflecting on the Sudanese conflict, said, "Reconciliation begins by agreeing to sit under the same tree with your enemy, to find a way of addressing the causes of the conflict." The point he was making is that political reconciliation is not dependent on the kind of intimacy that religious and some forms of individual reconciliation may demand. Rather, statecraft and politics require peaceful coexistence. Forgiveness may come later, after the creation of confidence and the building of trust. The Dinka elder was right. Political reconciliation is about opening up the lines of communication. It often requires compromises, sometimes even breaking ranks with powerful influences in one's own constituency. My third lesson from Mandela has to do with his understanding of the importance of working with and through others. His leadership style was honed in the political culture of the African National Congress, with its emphasis on cooperative and consultative leadership. So it should be no surprise to hear that in the international arena, he sought first and wherever feasible to work through multilateral organizations like the United Nations, the Non-Aligned Movement, the Organization of African Unity, and the Southern African Development Community. While he became, for a time, the most important spokesperson for the developing world, he sought also to be a bridge builder between rich and poor nations. Mandela's moral standing and his commitment to transcendent values drove him to continue his efforts to transform not only South Africa, but also the region and the continent. Arthur Schlesinger once wrote that every great power has its warrior caste. Mandela emerged from his long incarceration at a time when the projection of state power beyond its borders had become the domain largely of the warrior caste, with a concurrent emphasis on unilateralism. One of the most important insights from his life is what he taught us about the difference between two distinct forms of multilateralism. One is hierarchical, while the other is egalitarian. The first pursues a form of engagement with the world that is reminiscent of George Orwell's contention in Animal Farms, that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. The advocates of this form of multilateralism, a hierarchical multilateralism, derive their notion of what is best for the world almost exclusively from what seemed best in the short run for them. Their passion and sense of mission come from the belief that they are called somehow to save the world from itself. They are convinced that only they and a few chosen allies are in possession of ultimate truth and have therefore a monopoly on wisdom. The underlying premise of those who take this position is that international relations are relations of power, not principle. Power prevails, and principles legitimize what prevails. The practitioners of this new internationalism are not without principles. They simply derive their principles exclusively from national self-interest. The values they seek to promote and from which the world benefits, they argue, is American values. American power must thus be used to impose not just its interests, but its views and its values on the entire world. Hierarchical multilateralism is a form of social Darwinism that ignores the role of cooperation in the survival of the fittest and puts all of the emphasis on competition. Mandela reveled in a different form of multilateralism. He was always seeking partners who shared his belief that the great issues could be settled through a relationship of respect rather than rancor. He could have claimed moral authority, moral superiority, but he did not. He was optimistic that he could penetrate the worst instinct of his adversaries because while working to change their policies and practices, he demonstrated a respect for their humanity, an understanding of their traditions, and sensitivity to the demands of their culture. As a diplomat, he made the profession seem noble. His biographer, Anthony Sampson, makes the claim that as a politician, he was both pre-modern and postmodern. The same could be said about his role as a diplomat. He was pre-modern in that he was very much a product of the older tribal tradition in which he had been brought up, of a chief accountable to his people, settling their disputes with careful courtesy, making them all feel important, and representing them with a dignity and bearing that was as regal as anything we've seen in European royalty. Yet he was also postmodern, with a common touch, a brilliant sense of texture and timing, a master of imagery who knew how to work a room or how to flatter an adversary. He was the master of the photo op, the soundbite, the intimate handshake, the seductive smile, and the disarming charm. The difference from so many others is that all of this came naturally. It was not Nelson Mandela playing a role, it was simply Nelson Mandela being himself. I once complimented his communication director on their ability to put him in the right place at the right time with the right message, and he looked at me in amazement and said, "It's not us, it's the old man himself." He was pre-modern and postmodern at the same time. I will run quickly through the last two of the lessons I learned from Mandela. The fourth lesson comes from the way in which he exercised economic diplomacy, a principle at the core of his foreign policy. While he believed that markets were good for democracy and democracy good for markets, he also understood that while the idea of democracy originally meant that the people would have the power, it has now come to mean in many places that the people have the vote, which is not always the same thing as having the power. That is why his government sought to ensure that economic growth contributed to the empowerment of the economically marginalized and not simply the small minority who continued to control much of the nation's wealth. Operating out of a paradigm of corrective action, Mandela's South Africa required potential investors to show what value, what social good would be added by their presence. While the capitalism that took root looked remarkably like its Western counterpart, it had to undergo a vetting, market reforms, and empowerment strategies that reflected South Africa's unique situation. No South African could simply say, we're going to do it the American way. It had to look South African and be South African before that could be South African endorsement or South African ownership. South Africa then reflects the new reality of the world of foreign policy. Even the developing countries most desirous of economic engagement with the United States balk at any effort to induce or require them to do things the American way. We need to understand that many who reject globalization do so because they see it as essentially Americanization. Should they fear globalization? No. Should they be concerned about it? Yes. Kofi Annan argues that the poor are poor not because of too much globalization, but because of too little. Because they're not part of it. Because they are excluded. It is easy to observe from an American perspective the benefits of the global flow of capital, of technology, and people. It is easy for us as Americans to see the advantages of eliminating barriers to trade and travel. But the voices proclaiming the dangers of globalization are getting louder and more disturbing. The increasing discontent falls into two basic categories. The first involves the economic and political downside of globalization for developing economies. The financial volatility evident in the crisis a few years ago that led to the severe recession in some countries and an increase in inequality within, among others. But there's another category of discontent. It involves a crisis of expectation. Many of the new leaders of emerging democracies began their preparation for the assumption of power at a time when it was assumed that nation states, including developing nations, could manage their economies in ways that brought the benefits of a market economy to all of their people. As they came into power, however, they found that the ground had shifted and their economies were greatly affected by outside forces they could not control. In the end, no nation can avoid the challenge of globalization. But while we embrace the advantages it offers, we will need to help ease the anxieties it generates. Finally, there's much that we can learn from Nelson Mandela's role as a moral leader in international affairs. From his personal relationship and standing with the leaders of the rich nations, as well as those from the developing world. During my 4 years in South Africa, I saw many of them constantly beat a path to his door, seeking his advice on world problems, and of course, hoping to increase their stature at home by standing next to him. But while Nelson Mandela shared many of their public values and understood the importance of the developed nations to South Africa's developing economy, he did not hesitate to take an opposing stand where he felt morally bound to speak out. And so I want to conclude by highlighting several ethical norms and personal traits that provided the grounding for Nelson Mandela's transforming role in international affairs. The first was his belief in and his ability to appeal to people's better nature. He believes very strongly in the potential of individuals and even nation states to change. This is not the naivete of an idle dreamer, but the convictions of a man who has been involved in causing major change both publicly and behind the scene. This belief that people can be lifted into their better selves is the secret of Mandela's success as a leader and as a person. Secondly, his ability to connect with other people, even his adversaries. Scott Peck, the eminent psychiatrist, once wrote that we build community out of crisis and we build community by accident, but we do not know how to build community by design. That is in many ways true, but believe me, there's a lot that we can learn from Nelson Mandela in this regard. Thirdly, his lack of bitterness after 27 years of imprisonment. People throughout the world admired him and saw him as evidence of the potential of the human spirit. They marveled at his ability to forgive and wondered whether this was a characteristic unique to his tribal community or culture. But his spirit has had a contagious effect on others. I don't know how many of you remember the story of Amy Beale, who was killed as the new democracy was about to be launched. Her parents, Peter and Linda Beale, never imagined that they too had the capacity to forgive. But one day they found themselves before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, publicly forgiving and recommending amnesty for the young men who had killed their daughter. Nelson Mandela reminds us that the potential is in each of us. Fourth, his commitment to changing the practice of the adversary while maintaining respect for his or her humanity. He understood the requirements of both duty and decency. The fact that the real superiority of any form of government comes not so much from how its leaders deal with their friends, but how they deal with their enemies. This is what Martin Luther King called loving the enemy. It was based on Christian moral theology. Mandela's respect for the humanity of the adversary seems to come out of the African notion that to deny the dignity or damage the humanity of another person is to damage or deny one's own. And fifth and finally, his commitment to reconciliation as a public value and a public process. This may be his most important contribution to international affairs. While those who seek to emulate Mandela talk most about healing and forgiveness, they forget that reconciliation for Mandela was a continuum that included not only storytelling, confession, and apology, but some form of restitution. Howard Thurman, the black mystic, theologian, and poet, could have been speaking for Nelson Mandela when he described his own prescription for diplomacy in the simple words, I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you. Can you imagine how different our world would be if more Americans were able to say, I want to be an American, without making it difficult for Arabs to be Arabs, Africans to be Africans, or Asians to be Asians? Can you imagine how different our nation would be if more Christians were able to say, I want to be a Christian, without making it difficult for Jews to be Jews, Muslims to be Muslims, Buddhists to be Buddhists or Hindus to be Hindus. Can you imagine how different our world would be if we were blessed with more Mandelas? But since a leader like him comes around once in a generation, or even once in a millennium, what we can do and what we must do is to prepare a new generation of public servants who are willing to walk in his footsteps. Congratulations again on your efforts to do just that here at the Clinton School of Public Service. Thank you very much. I'll stick around and answer questions for a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, obviously, there's nothing to talk about. I'm going to ask one question before everybody has to leave. We talk so much about pacifism and peace movements, and we recognize so frequently Gandhi and Martin King. How would you compare Mandela to the ideas and the values that those other two men have given?
After Joseph Nye wrote his book on soft power, he also published an article in the Washington Post in which he talked about soft power, hard power, and smart power. Smart power was knowing when it was best and most appropriate to use hard power, when it was best and most appropriate to use soft power. Mandela was in that tradition. King and Gandhi advocated soft power, and they were very effective in the context in which they worked. I organized the local civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the 60s, and our total strategy was a commitment to nonviolence. But I did so immediately after getting out of the United States Army as an officer. And so I was willing to use nonviolence as the only kind of strategy that could work in that situation. But when I came home in the evenings from one of our mass meetings and I saw my neighbor next to me sitting in his front yard holding a gun, protecting the entrance to my front door so the Klan could not get to my family, I understood smart power. And so all I would say is that they have many, many similarities. And commitment to a sort of moral ideal, and that commitment to the use of nonviolence. But Mandela differed in that he was also willing to use hard power if it seemed absolutely necessary to achieve a moral ideal.
I think we'll take a break for those people who really do need to leave, and the rest of you please stay
Thank you.
around. I will continue
Good.
to ask questions in about
I can now use a glass.
My name is Benito Benedicto. I'm from Tanzania. And speech or lecture is for many years, Nelson Mandela was called terrorist.
Yes.
My name is Benito Benedicto. I'm from Tanzania. For many years, before 90s, Nelson Mandela was called terrorist, and African National Congress was called a terrorist group. I think that you know about that.
I made reference to that. Yeah.
Okay, and some of the leaders in the Western countries, like Margaret Thatcher, and other leaders in this nation, they also
Right.
refer Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. So now we are living in this world where we are fighting the war on terror. And for many leaders, you mentioned even the president of the World Bank, even this country now they're saying we need to to support poor countries like in Africa because of the security reason. Because if those people who are about 350 million people, Africans who are poor, if you don't support them, maybe they'll turn to be attack America, which to me, I don't buy that. I think our problem in Africa is our security of the food. It's a poverty. I don't think Africans, they can turn and come and attack the United States for no reason. So, my point is, during the Cold War, Africa was the ground for war. It was not called in Africa. You know, people like Mobutu and other people, they were used because during the Cold War. If this the war on terror is going to affect Africa countries, like the war during the Cold War, because somehow we are being used during the Cold War to fight somebody's war. Is it going to be the same thing in this war? Is real the problem Africa? Is this security is going to turn to be a problem of terror in Africa? I don't know if you got my point.
Well, you asked many questions, I gather, but let me try and answer several. The first one is about the use of the word, the vocabulary we use to refer to adversaries. What we came to realize when I was supporting the ANC in that struggle, and therefore I was accused of supporting terrorism, is that one person's terrorist may be another person's freedom fighter. And sometimes it depends on which side you're on. That's my first answer. The second is that, no, I don't think there are likely to be Africans who are poor who are likely to come to the United States to attack the United States. That is not the nature of Africans, first of all, to begin with. That's why I referred to the concept of Ubuntu. But I do know that there is increasing resentment, hostility, and frustration that makes it almost difficult to represent your nation across the continent without the fear of some potential violent act. That's the environment in which we now live. And so it's not so much whether terrorism is likely to come to the United States, but is what terrorists, so-called, might do to an American traveling abroad, particularly one who has had some engagement with the government and who there is seen as a representative of the government. You ask public servants who are now in foreign affairs about the precautions they have to take. In my first 2 years as an ambassador in South Africa were very different from my last 2 years. I'm a spontaneous person. I like to be with the people. After what happened in Kenya and Tanzania in blowing up the American embassy, I always had to travel with security. That's the kind of world that is a problem for those Americans abroad that I don't think a lot of Americans at home understand. And that's my concern about terrorism. Yes, ma'am.
You should let me go first. Because my question's not quite so interesting.
Oh, I bet it is.
I want to clarify something you said. My name is Carol Smith, and I live here in Little Rock. And you quoted, I need to get the author of the quote. I want to be me without making it difficult for you to use. Would you repeat who that quote was from?
It was from Howard Thurman, Thurman. He was a theologian, a poet, and a mystic who taught Martin Luther King at Boston University. He is a man that almost everybody should know, but few people have heard of. And I suspect that that's a defect in our educational system and a reflection of what happened to African Americans like him at the time in which he lived. But his name. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, before I start, Dr. Bruce, Now, I've been to movies where I wanted to see the movie again after I saw it, but I've never been to a speech where I wanted to hear the speech again. But there's a lot of stuff, and I'd like to share your speech with other people. So I was hoping that the Printing School would publish it on the website or something so I can print it out and read it, because I know I missed a lot. And I can share it with folks.
I'll be willing to share it with them. I gave you a condensed version because I recognized that some of you were going to have to leave and I got here late. So I'll give him the full version, which on the last 2 points has a little more detail.
Appreciate that. I want to ask you a question, because it's unavoidable to think about our current. I'm Glenn Nishimura. I live here in Little Rock. I work in the Delta community organization.
Okay.
But it's unavoidable to think about your words and not try to apply it to what's happening in the United States. And especially that issue about values, the issue about values. Because in the last election, and I won't talk about products and politics, but in the last election we were told that we expect people to vote their own interests. And when the vote didn't turn out the way it's supposed to, so under that kind of definition, we said, well, people voted their values rather than their own interests, their own economic interests. And what you were talking about was the difference between individual values versus the concept of societal values, a mass agreement that societal values are different. And I'm wondering if you're giving that the societal values will be different than the personal values necessarily. The personal values being your religion, your abortion, whatever. The societal values and how you operate as a country can be different, and Nelson Mandela has done that. I was wondering if you could take that kind of analysis a step further and talk about how you get to focusing a country on a set of societal values and making it mean change in that country.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked that question. It is the one I'm most engaged in thinking about these days, because I have a contract with the Duke Press to complete a book by the end of this year, which is entitled Private Virtues and Public Values, The Changing Role of Ethics. And so I get to plug it a year before it's published. But when I was organizing the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, we took our faith into the public square. But we did not seek to impose the private virtues of our faith on the public vision of the nation. What we did, we sought to appeal to the most basic and fundamental values that all Americans agree on, which are public values, because they're in the Constitution. If you remember in the preamble to the Constitution, when the founders thought about how to form a more perfect union, the first thing they said is we'd have to establish justice. We'd have to ensure domestic tranquility. We'd have to promote the general welfare. And so the public values of the nation are those values. The private virtues of one's faith is the private virtues of one's faith. And they have to do with what I call the microethics of individual behavior. What we ought to be making sure is in the public arena are the public values that build community, the public values that are in the preamble to our Constitution. Now, interestingly enough, if one looks at those public values, they come exactly and directly out of the three Abrahamic faiths. But there is nothing in the preamble that relates it to the Abrahamic faith. It simply says, these are the values of the American people. In order to form a more perfect union, this is what we've got to do. And so we've got to go back to bringing those values in the public arena as the public values of the nation. The problem of it is that in the 60s, when we talked about public values, we were talking about peace, we were talking about justice, we were talking about equality of opportunity, and somewhere along the way, the national discourse shifted from an understanding of public values as the macro values to an understanding of public values as the micro virtues. And I don't think it's either or. I think we need to try to find a way to balance our emphasis on the micro and the macro rather than having these swings in history from one to the other. And so the major challenge before us now is how do we support and encourage people to inculcate the private virtues of their faith without telling them as a public that they have to do it, but telling them as a public that these are the public values you're required as a citizen to support.
Yeah, I apologize for being so inarticulate in answering my question.
Oh, you were very articulate.
It's you know, the press and the way the press works and politics and the way politics work, it's sort of, taken over that whole debate about public values and trying to get your message out or any message out has to butt up against all those institutions that have kind of become, in some ways, agents of status quo. But I'm wondering whether or not you think that, when we talk about the great movements, we talk about individuals. And I'm wondering whether or not you think that that's a necessity, that we have a king or Gandhi or a Mandela,
Yeah.
and that if we can't personify virtue in a person, we can't grab it.
Yeah. Well, I teach courses on leadership, and I always talk about the notion of a leader as a leader of leaders. And so that he cannot lead or she cannot lead unless there are other leaders, and his or her responsibility is to empower those other leaders so that they can realize their potential and also lead. And so I would much prefer to talk about a collegial understanding of leadership. Nelson Mandela would too. He used to say very often, it's not me, it's Walter Sisulu, it's Govan Mbeki, it's Oliver Tambo. I am just the person they pushed out front. Now, the reason that we have high-profile leaders is because they're the ones who are given access. They're the ones who we invite into the door. The lower profile leaders, although they may be just as critical or as essential to the movement, may not have the profile that provides access. And so therefore you have to have somebody who can represent you in the corridors of power, even though the actual leadership takes place on a daily basis by a lot of people. And Mandela understood that. You see, Mandela was more than just a person, more than just a leader, he was a myth. I mean, he was incarcerated for 27 years. And there were leaders out there who kept the myth of Mandela alive. And so when he came out, he was larger than life because of the work of his wife Winnie, because of the work of Desmond Tutu, because of the work of lots of other people who kept his name omnipresent before us as a people. And very few people get to be both an icon who is a myth and an icon who is real. Mandela was both. Yes. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the microphone's already here. Absolutely.
Opinion here that I'm actually scared to imagine going to a presentation by you when you are not stressed from plane challenges that opportunity to run.
Oh yes, it's still sitting there, it's gone.
I was also very, very pleased with the presentation. It was one of the very few that you sit through and you're not saying, gee, I hope this ends right away. I don't have business. I was dangerous to make some of these comments, but you made a comment about one person's terrorist being another's freedom fighter. And while we oftentimes in this country, especially at this particular time of the year, make reference to the cowardness of the folks who, I guess, planned and carried out the 9/11 events, and particularly because of the cowardly use of life and cross. There was about 200 plus years ago that the nations of the world referred to another country fighters as being cowards and not following the traditions of war. And because they too realized that if they followed the traditions of war at that time, they would have not been able to stand up to the prevailing power of England and would have lost their attempted freedom. And I imagine that the Hezbollah and the Al-Qaeda will also understand the same thing. Not to say that I agree with them, but they will understand the same thing. The gentleman made reference to Africa, and I think he was making reference to Africa as a potential powder keg, or certainly a pivotal block in this balance of power between the West and I'm not sure it's exactly just the Muslim community, but let's say the whole world. And with also the increase, I guess for the first time in years, the fastest growing religion being the Muslim religion, not necessarily suggest again that all Muslims are members of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or whatever. How do you see the African continent, and especially because of the poverty, playing a role in this balance of power in the West versus the non-aligned, non-Western aligned countries as we move forward in this century?
I am sure there will always be a small minority whose resentment, whose frustration, whose hostility will be transformed into acts of violence. But for the overwhelming majority of the people, they may resent our foreign policy in some instances. They may resent our arrogance in other instances. They may resent our paternalism in other instances, but they're not going to turn to violence. However, unless we begin to deal with the paternalism, the arrogance, and the foreign policy decisions they resent, I fear that we provide a breeding ground for the recruitment of people who might become terrorists. But as I look at and as I talk to people now, I have no fear that Africans are going to suddenly become a continent with a lot of terrorists. That's just not the nature of the people. I mean, I talked about Ubuntu. That's what it's called in Southern Africa, in West Africa, in East Africa. It may go by another name, but there is a concept of community that we need to learn from and embrace, because it is a caring, inclusive notion of community. The ANC wrote into the charter of their organization, the African National Congress, in the worst days of apartheid, when things were at its worst, they wrote into the charter of their freedom movement organization that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Isn't that incredible? You know what I mean? But that's a reflection of that spirit of Ubuntu. And so instead of fearing it, what's on the continent, we need to learn from it and in many ways embrace it. But very few people have thought about the possibility that there was something to learn from African humanism or even from traditional African religion, the kind of respect for nature and respect for human beings that come out of that. And so I don't worry about terrorists emerging out of Africa on a large scale. But having said that, I have to say that there will be some people who will be attracted and who may be moved to engage in violent acts because of the resentment and the hostility they feel. Now, one of the things that one has to keep in mind, and I don't want to compare to 9/11, but it does reflect some other conditions, is that terrorists with tanks are somehow more acceptable than terrorists who use their body, because that's the last vehicle and the only vehicle they have. And so if we're going to condemn terrorism, let's condemn it in all its forms, whether it's sophisticated or crude. Yes.
A while ago about public values versus private values, because I see this as being one of the impediments, the great impediments that we're dealing with in the political discourse that goes on in our country. You're going to send me back to reading that very little document about in order to perform a more perfect union. Because what you said there, that approves.
It has.
What we have done is we have diluted this values business and put private values as the standard of valid, well, sometimes patriotism. But the right wing versus the left wing of religion, it's terrible what we are doing to each other religiously. And I think what you're saying is if we could put the focus on the public values, that whatever our faith, whatever the branch of faith that we have come through privately, these are what we have decided are the great values. And I just treasure that insight, and I thank you for it so very much. Because it seems to me that the direction in which we're going is that the individual things, whether it's abortion or gay rights or whatever it is, that the test of public values seems to have to do with what you think about the private values. And that's tearing us apart in my
Yeah. And you know, sir, it's exacerbated by the press. And let me tell you a good example. After the last election, there were a lot of exit polling done. And they asked people, how many of your votes were your votes based on a concern about values? And they said yes. And when you disaggregate those values, they were very narrow individual group concerns. But then at the same time, they asked people, what motivated your vote? And they may have talked about the poverty. They may have talked about racism and justice. And so when the poll says that this many people based their vote on values, they were not talking about these people who based their vote on values too. Because they said, I was concerned about our educational system, I was concerned about equity for the disadvantaged, I was concerned about justice, I was concerned about peace, you know. And somehow the press reports to us that it is these people who were concerned about the micro who voted on the basis of values, and these other people who voted on the basis of macro values are somehow excluded. And so that's where we got to get back in the balance here. I mean, the way in which value-oriented people are represented. I certainly voted on the basis of my values, but I didn't qualify for that poll because the way it phrased the question suggested that values were something very different. But anyway, I think it's a good point, and I think we probably have come to the end of the...
We've come to the end. I'm sorry to say that it's the end. Thank you again so much.
You're welcome.